What's up everybody, my name is Khaled, and in this video we're learning how to build a modal component in Stencil.js. In the last video we learned how to build a button, which is extremely simple, but more importantly we learned how to get started with Stencil and kind of how to set up the boilerplate that is required to set up using Stencil. But in this one, yeah, we're building a modal component, and the really cool features about this is the fact that we can use the events and the event emitter, the state, passing objects through props, and finally being able to host specific files like an SVG dedicated to one single component and kind of referencing that. So there's a lot of neat features. The modal that we are building is what you see on the screen, and it is responsive. So all you responsive junkies out there, which should be everybody, you should be happy about this one. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. One thing to mention is if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. That truly helps out the channel and allows me to grow. And if you haven't joined the Discord, be sure to join the Discord because there's a lot of great stuff on there. Enough rambling, let's go ahead and jump into the project and learn about building a component of modals in Stencil. To get us started, we're going to need to generate a new Stencil component. In the terminal, I'll run npm run generate. This will ask us for a component tag name, and the component tag name we'll provide is apollo-modal. I'll leave all the additional files checked and hit enter. Next, I'll run npm run start to get our project running. Now in our project, what I'll do in the index.html is just get rid of all of the Apollo buttons that we had displayed from before, and then for the h3, I'll just switch that to a modal. Now in the file explorer, I'll go ahead and click on components and open up the Apollo modal folder. Apollo modal folder. That's a tongue twister. Yeah, so go ahead and open up the Apollo modal tsx file, and for the JSX, we'll get rid of the host and slot tags. I'll then paste in a modal wrapper div, and I do have the react autocomplete, so it's going to add class name, so just don't mind that. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. Then I'm going to add a modal overlay div, which would represent the backdrop of our modal. Then a div with a modal class. And inside the modal class, I'll add a header div, a body div, and a footer div, all being siblings to each other and a child to the modal. Inside the header class, I'll add an h6 tag with the modal header text. And as a sibling, I'll add a div with a closed class. Inside this closed class, I'll return an SVG that would have an X icon. Now in our body, I'll add a slot, which allows us to pass in children data from the Apollo modal tag in our HTML. And in our footer, I'll reuse a component we had already built in the past, which is an Apollo button. As its props, I'll pass text for confirm, and the appearance will be set to primary. If I switch to our index.html page, I can now add the Apollo modal. And if we preview, you could see we have a modal header with the confirm button. If I add some text for our slot for the body content, you could see that now in our body div, there is that body content text. Now back in our project and in the Apollo modal tsx, I will want to add the SVG. To add assets such as images or icons, we can pull in a getAssetPath function, and in the component decorator, I'll add assets dirs, which is the assets directory, and I'll provide an array with different paths for our assets. Since we only have one asset folder, I'll just write assets, and then inside the Apollo modal folder, I'll create an assets folder with the SXVG icon inside of it. Now, if you're following along and you want to grab this SVG icon, you could head over to the repository and locate the XSVG inside of our Apollo modal assets. You can switch to the code view and grab the SVG and just simply paste it, or just download the SVG. I'll have the link in the description if you have a hard time finding it. We'll go ahead and paste it in the XSVG, and switching back to Apollo modal tsx, we'll add an image tag. I'll go ahead and add an alt of close icon for our alt. And now we need to bring in the prop decorator from Stencil Core. Inside the Apollo modal class, I'll add a prop decorator with the name of close icon, and close icon will be a string that will represent the file name of the SVG we want to use, which is x.svg. Now inside of our image source, we're going to call that getAssetPath function, and we're going to use a template literal to direct us to the assets folder and paste in this .close icon, which represents the SXVG. Since we did add a new file, we do need to restart the development server. So open up the console and restart. Now, if we take a look, we can see the SVG icon working perfectly for us. So up next, we need to start styling out our modal. So I'll switch to the Apollo modal.css and get to work. I'll add a comment for the modal wrapper, and adding our parent dev, I'll add a modal wrapper with the position of fixed. Let's go ahead and close the terminal so that we have more room to work with. And then I'll set the top, bottom, left, right to 0. Since the initial state of our modal is hidden and the opacity is 0, I'll go ahead and add an opacity of 0 and then a visibility of hidden. I'll then add some basic transition styles, updating the visibility, opacity, and transform. I'll then set the z-index to 10. I'll go ahead and comment visibility hidden so the styles don't apply just yet. Then I'll work on the modal overlay. I'll set the background to an RGBA of 000, which is black, and then the alpha, which is opacity, is 0.6. I'll add the height and the width to 100% with an absolute position. Next, we'll want to target the modal. So I'll write modal wrapper, and then as its child, I'll write modal. I'll set the background to our variable of white. I'll add a width of 600 pixels and a height of auto. I'll set the position to absolute, a left of 50%, and then a transform translate of the x-axis to -50%, and then a 0 for the y. This will allow us to center, and then a border radius set to 4 pixels, and some transition styles, setting the visibility, opacity, and transform to a 0.25 seconds. Next, let's go ahead and target the header. So I'll write modal wrapper.modal.header. I'll add the padding of 16 pixels to the header, a font size of 16 pixels. Then I'll add a display of flex, align items to center, and justify content space between. This will allow us to space the close icon and the header apart from each other. Then a border bottom of 1 pixel and a solid line with the mono 05 variable color. Let's then tackle the H6 that's inside of our header. I'll set the margin to 0 and the line height to 1. Now, let's go ahead and preview, but before we do, let's scroll to the top and comment out the opacity 0 as well. If we go ahead and preview, you can see that it's getting to where we want it, but it's still quite ugly. So let's go back in our project and keep going. I noticed that the H6 or the modal header font size 16 pixels wasn't working on the header. So I'll take the font size of 16 pixels and add it to the H6 instead. Next, I'll target the close icon inside of our header. I'll set the height and the width to 24 pixels, a display of flex, align items to center, and the justify content to center. I'll add a border radius of 4 pixels and a cursor set to pointer. Finally, the transition is going to be 0.1 second with ease in and out. Let's go ahead and add a hover on the close icon. So when we hover on it, we want to add a background color of the variable mono 10. And now we can tackle the modal body. I'll add the .modal wrapper class with the modal, and then inside the modal, I have a body class. I'll set the padding to 16 pixels, font size to 14 pixels, the line height to 21 pixels, and the max height to 320 pixels. With the height also set to auto. I'll also add an overflow Y of auto, and the color of our text is going to be set to the variable color of mono-50. If we preview, you can see that we are making some progress, so let's keep going. Next, for our modal footer, I'm going to give it a padding of 16 pixels, similar to the body and the header, and then a display of flex. We'll justify the content to flex in so that they can be on the right side. We'll align the items to center, and we'll add a border top of 1 pixels that is solid with the variable color of mono 05. Then let's tackle the Apollo buttons that are inside the footer. I'll add a margin of 0 and 6 pixels left and right. And if we preview, you can see that it has some space between the margins. Now, because I'm adding the margin, I want to go back to the Apollo modal.tsx and add an additional Apollo button. And this will be just a cancel button without an appearance. If we preview now, you can see that these items or these buttons have margin in the left and right section. But then I want to change the first child and the last child so that they have different margins. For our first child, which is our first button, I only want to set a margin of 6 pixels to the right. And for our last child, I only want to set a margin of 6 pixels to the left. That way there isn't that excess amount of margin that adds to the padding edges. Don't forget to add the dot to the modal wrapper for our last child button. And if we preview now, you can see that it is perfectly aligned to the right from the X button down to the cancel button. And that's because of our 16 pixels that is wrapping around our entire modal. I'll then want to work on active styles. And what this means is when we've clicked to open our modal, we want to make it active or appear. So scrolling to the top, I'll uncomment the visibility hidden and opacity 0 so that we can actually hide it. And then I'll create an isOpen class, which will attach when we want to open our modal. I'll set the opacity to 1, the visibility to visible, and then I'll also add a transition, which we've been reusing for the visibility, opacity, and the transform. When we add the isOpen class to our modal wrapper, I want to target the .modal, and I want to translate specifically the Y set to 90 pixels so that it can be pushed down 90 pixels. I'll then add media queries just so that we can have a responsive modal. I'll set the max width to 600 pixels, and then targeting the modal itself, I'll set the width to 100% and the bottom to 0. I'll then add a transform translate. I'll always set it to -50% for the X so that it can be centered, and then 100% so that it can be pushed to the bottom, and then an opacity of 1. And then for the isOpen.modal, we're switching the Y to be 0. Okay, so that does it for the CSS. We can go ahead and scroll to the top and close it. If we switch back to the Apollo modal.tsx, since I am not using a host, I can get rid of that import. And now what we need to focus on is allowing our props to be mutable. By default, our props are immutable. From inside the component logic, once a value is set by a user, the component cannot be updated internally. However, it's possible to explicitly allow a prop to be mutated from the inside of the component by declaring it as mutable, meaning if we wanted to update the isOpen prop from true to false, we need to set our props as mutable so that they can be changed. We can also set reflect to true, which in our case will set the isOpen prop as an HTML attribute for our modal component. To add this, all you need to do is use the prop decorator and pass an object for its configuration. We'll pass a mutable of true and a reflect of true. Now we can add a prop for isOpen, and the type will be set to a boolean. I'll go ahead and just clean up the formatting. And what we'll want to do next is update the class of our modal overlay dependent on if isOpen is true or not. So I'll use a ternary operator in the class of this.isOpen. If it is open, I'll use the class names of modal wrapper and isOpen. Otherwise, I'll just use modal wrapper. Remember that the isOpen class allows us to make the modal visible. In our index.html, what I'll do is add an Apollo button with the text prop of open modal and the appearance of primary. What we want to do is when we click on the Apollo button, we want to open the modal. So underneath the body tags, I'll add a script and I'll set the variable of button to document.querySelector Apollo button, and then the variable of modal to document.querySelector Apollo modal. I'll then add an event listener to our button of click, which will run a function that will then target the modal.isOpen and set it to true. Now if we preview, and when we click on our button, it updates the isOpen prop to true, making our modal visible. We can open up the console and check out the mobile responsiveness, and you can clearly see it is responsive. Now the issue that we see is that we can't close this modal. We'll have to refresh the page. So let's actually add or create a function that will allow us to close the modal. Inside the Apollo modal.tsx, I'll create a section for our functions. I'll create a private handle cancel function. The reason it's private is because we can only use it within our class. And what this function will do is just set isOpen to false. So this.isOpen and set it to false. I'll then go ahead and add an onClick attribute to our modal overlay, passing in this .handleCancel function. and I'll do the exact same thing for our close icon. Now, if we go ahead and open up the modal, if I select the backdrop or the overlay, you can see that the modal does go away. And if I select the X button or the close button, it goes away as well. Now let's go ahead and focus on working with the buttons, the confirm and the cancel, and also passing in dynamic props or data for the modal header. Back in our project, I'm going to create additional props. The first prop being a header, which will take the type of string. Our next prop is going to be for appearance, which will also take a string. This appearance will be primarily focused to the look of our button. I'm going to scroll down to the H6 and replace the content with this dot header so that we can load the dynamic data, and change the appearance to this dot appearance as well. Now in our index.html, I'll pass header as hello YouTube and appearance as danger. Now if we preview and open the modal, you'll see that the modal header says hello YouTube, and the primary action or button in our modal is a danger button. I can add additional content to the body content. I could just add change with a bunch of exclamation marks, and you could see that it does actually update the content of our body. Okay, perfect. So now what I want to do is actually add dynamic buttons and provide some sort of action for them. Back in our project, I'll switch to the Apollo modal tsx file, and I'm going to just comment out the 2 Apollo buttons in our footer. Now for this part, we need to add additional logic so that we can handle objects and arrays through props. Since we can't handle arrays and objects in our props, what we'll need to do is define them as strings, and then create a function that will turn it into a usable array or object. So now I've defined a prop of buttons, which is a type of string. What I'll then need to do is define some state so that we can store our new buttons array. I'll define state, and I'll put an underscore buttons so that we know that it's related to our buttons prop. And for the type, I'll add an array of any. Be sure to import state from Stencil core. And then now at the bottom, what we need to do is watch for our data. I'll have a function called array data watcher. Something to keep in mind, if the data is being updated, we do need to add a watch decorator, but since we're just passing data that's not going to be changed, aka our button values, we don't need to add the watch decorator. As a parameter for the array data watcher, I'll patch buttons, and what I'll say is if the type of buttons is equal to a string, then what we want to do is set this dot underscore buttons to json.parse our buttons parameter. I'll then add an else and set this dot underscore buttons to whatever the buttons parameter is. So again, if our buttons prop is a string, we'll want to json.parse the string so that it can actually be a readable object or array. Underneath the array data watcher, we're going to use a lifecycle called component will mount, which allows us to run the array data watcher function before the component mounts. So I will add this dot array data watcher and pass in this dot buttons, which is our buttons prop, aka that string we're passing in, and then it will run the function which turns it into an actual array that we can use. So in our index.html, I'll add buttons and I'll add quotations because it has to be a string. I'll then add an array with an object of text set to confirm. I'll then create another object for our second button and set text to cancel. Now back in our Apollo modal tsx, to get a better understanding, I'll add a console log in the component will load. I'll console log this dot buttons and I'll set that to the original string, and then I'll console log this dot underscore buttons and I'll set that to the new array. Now if we preview and open up the console, let's go ahead and refresh. What you'll see at the top is a string of what our buttons is, and then the second console log, which is our new array, the underscore buttons, we can see that we actually have an array we can work with. If we open up the modal, you can tell that there aren't any buttons because we haven't set any buttons. So let's go ahead and add that array of buttons to our modal. I'll scroll down towards the footer. And what I'll want to do is map through the underscore buttons. So I'll write this dot underscore buttons dot map. I'll pass button and the index as parameters. And what I'll return is a single Apollo button setting text to button dot text. And for our appearance, what I want is only for our first button, which is our primary button, to have the appearance. So what I'll say is index is equal to 0, and I'll write the and this dot appearance. This is another form of writing a ternary operator without the else. So if we preview, you can see we now have our confirm of that danger color and the cancel. If I wanted to change this, I can go into the index.html, and for our first button, I could write happy, and the second button I'll write sad. And if we preview, you can see that both happy and sad are being displayed as our buttons. Now let's add functionality to these buttons. I'll have a primary action, and then for the secondary action, we'll just cancel out the modal. I'll switch the text back to confirm and cancel, and I'll scroll to the top so that we can create a new function. And I'll scroll up underneath our functions, and what we want to do is be able to add logic from outside of this Apollo modal to be executed when we select the button. This calls for us using the event decorator. I'll add an event decorator with a private action, and the type will be an event emitter. At the very top from Stencil core, we need to import an event and the event emitter. Be sure to spell event emitter correctly. I added double I's instead of double T's. So go ahead and fix that typo. And what we'll want to do is create a private function called handle action, which will handle our primary action. In this function, what we'll do is write this .action.emit, which will allow us to fire our action function when called. We haven't actually defined what that function will do, but we'll do that in the index.html. If we scroll down and in the Apollo button, I'll add an onClick attribute. And now this action will only be specific to our first primary button, which is the index of 0. So if the index of 0 is true, then I will add this.action. Otherwise, my other button is going to be a this.handleCancel. In our index.html, what I'll want to do now is actually define what our action will do. To do that, you'll need to add an event listener to the modal, and then you'll pass action or whichever event you've defined, and we'll run a function. So what I want to do is keep it simple and just add a console log saying confirm pressed, meaning we've actually pressed the confirm button. I'll go ahead and open up the modal, and if we select cancel, it will close the modal, and if we select confirm, it will run the function of confirm pressed. So what's happening is the event emitter is triggering an event when an action is taken place in the index.html. That action being us pressing on the confirm button. The last thing I'll do is just change the appearance of our modal to a primary, and then for the content, I'll just add some random text and then change header to say modal header. If we preview our final result, you can clearly see it looks like a very lovely modal on mobile devices. And if we hit confirm, we'll get our confirm press logic, and we can always close the modal. Now, if we have lots of content, what should happen is there should be an automatic scroll bar that should be added. So if I go back in our project and I add just a bunch of content and preview it, you see that a scroll bar will automatically be added to our modal. Now you could customize this even further. This is a very simple modal. You can add props such as a size to define a large modal or a small modal. So you can really go above and beyond with adding additional props or settings to our modal. Okay, so that's going to wrap things up. We have fully completed our Apollo modal component. If you did enjoy this, please leave a like, don't forget to subscribe, and have a wonderful day.